and Dr. Roxanne is a licensed clinical psychologist who uses her extensive training in private practice. Questions are welcome by calling 855-237-2346. That's 855-237-2346. Here now is Father Nicholas and Dr. Roxanne.
Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to Live with the Lows. We are so excited that you've taken the time to join us once again this Tuesday evening. I'm Dr. Roxanne, for those of you who don't know me by now, and I'm usually joined by Father Nicholas, who's my husband and also my co-host. But tonight, he's actually away at a clergy retreat for our metropolis. So he arrived safely and has been in meetings all day and connecting with other priests. So it's a good thing for his soul and for our church. He's definitely looking forward to joining us again next week, though. And for those of you who don't know, we serve together at St. John the Divine Greek Orthodox Church, and that's right here in Jacksonville, Florida. So this show, for those of you who may not have listened before, is an extension of our ministry in that church. And it's really, been our attempt to merge our disciplines, the study of human behavior with the principles of our faith. And we feel that this is such a synergistic relationship. It really helps us better deal with modern day difficulties that are affecting all of us, one of which we're going to be talking about later this evening. So before we get started with tonight's topic, we want to remind you that, as you know, this is a live call-in show. And if the topic we are talking about tonight has been heavy on your heart, or the life of someone that you love, we definitely always want to hear from you. We welcome your questions, your comments, and even your stories, because chances are, if it's happened to you, there's somebody out there listening who wants to feel less alone in hearing your story. You can give us a call anytime throughout the show by calling in at 1-855-237-2346. Again, that number is 1-855-237-2346. We also welcome you to join our show as it streams live on Ancient Faith's Facebook page. And there you can type in your questions as well. We're going to be trying to monitor that throughout the show and try to bring them on air as time allows. And finally, if you are downloading this show as a podcast, all of our shows are actually podcasted. We thank you for taking the time to join us. We want to remind you to also stay connected to us all throughout the week. We're on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. I am still wrapping my head around how to do all of the social media, but I'm pretty good at Facebook by now. The rest of them we're struggling, but we're getting there. We're located under the heading of The Lows. That's an interesting spelling. It's Louhs, The Lows. Our Facebook page is home to about over 5,000 people who receive our daily inspirational messages. There, it's just a little encouragement that I think we could all use throughout the week. It's based on lots of different experiences that I have, that Father Nicholas has, that we see in our parish, and that we also, that I see in private practice working with people every day. So we try to make them pretty relevant. And you can also subscribe to them by going to our website at thelows.com and just enter your email where it says subscribe, and you'll start receiving them in your inbox. Well, tonight we are going to be talking about a topic that has definitely been relevant to all of our lives. Probably this very moment, we're going to take a deeper look into the psychological impact of living in this COVID era. And here to join us tonight is a special guest, Dr. Casey Clardy. Dr. Clardy bridges the intersection of faith and psychology, as we do, and she does so in her work in healthcare and community-based settings. As a Spanish-speaking licensed psychologist, she's dedicated her career to addressing health disparities and inequalities in under-resourced communities of color. She's currently a clinical supervisor and faculty member at Lawndale Christian Health Center in Chicago. She's passionate about teaching professionals and students how to address the mental health and substance use needs of high-risk populations, and she does so from a Christian perspective. Dr. Clardy has also served as an adjunct professor at her alma mater, Fuller Theological Seminary, where she earned her PhD in clinical psychology and her Master's of Divinity. We are so excited to welcome Dr. Clardy to the show. Welcome, Dr. Clardy.
Thank you so much. It's great to be live here. Ancient Faith Radio has such a special place in my heart as part of my story in coming to Orthodoxy. And it's also just wonderful to be here with you and in absence, but in presence with us with Father Nick. My family originally is from the Jacksonville area and still
Oh,
have some
how neat.
family in that area. Yeah, so it's great. Thanks for
That
having
is
me.
so cool. Yes, absolutely. Well, and I know you are an active participant in OCAMPR, which is an organization we really value. It's right up our alley. The Orthodox Christian Association of Medicine, Psychology, and Religion. And I know you're going to be speaking there at this upcoming conference. For those of you who are close to Phoenix or anywhere in the surrounding area, that conference is going to be in November, in just a couple of months in Phoenix, Arizona. So I want to get to talking a little bit about OCAMPR and of course the conference. But tell us a little bit about yourself and the work that you're doing right now.
Yeah, so I'm a licensed clinical psychologist, and I've been serving in the Chicagoland area for the little over the last decade. And I get the unique privilege of getting to serve high risk, underserved communities of color on the west side of Chicago. Now, if folks have seen different news articles or even sometimes movies about the Chicago West Side, you may have seen a lot of different negative publicity, just lots of discussion about brutality and murder and crime and gang and overdose. And some of that definitely is true. But often we don't hear a lot of the stories of resilience and growth and community and the strength of the neighborhoods that we work in. And so, part of, I think, my transformation and kind of really discerning my call in my ministry is realizing that even with my profession, I am choosing to be intentional and be a part of a community as opposed to simply serving a community. And so, some of that, the way that we incarnationally live out our ministry and our calling, has just really shaped my understanding as a psychologist, as an Orthodox Christian, and as someone who also supervises and trains, the next generations of psychologists as well as medical providers.
I love that, and I'm sure you have some pretty incredible stories to share, and probably how much not only you're changing their lives, but how much they're changing yours through your work there. I want to talk a little bit about. I mean, obviously this population that you're serving, and we're going to get to that in just a bit. But can you talk a little bit about OCAMPR's mission? Because I want to get to the title of their conference. That's going to be the topic of our conversation today. But for those of you who don't know OCAMPR, I want Dr. Clardy to comment just a little bit on the mission of that organization.
Absolutely. If you are not familiar with OCAMPR, I highly encourage you to go to the website, ocamper.org. You can definitely look on the links from Ancient Faith Radio. It's a community. It is a living, breathing community of folks in the healthcare field, in mental health professions, as well as clergy. And so it is definitely a holistic trifecta of sorts. And it's a wonderful conference that once I realized that this conference existed, I have definitely been a part of it ever since and been back every year. And so the real mission and heart behind OCAMPR is to help join healers, helpers, caregivers of all kinds in order to provide more quality, holistic care for patients, parishioners, and themselves. And so it's a wonderful gathering that is open to really any professions and caregivers and folks. And so it also has a great student ministry and kind of outreach to those. And there's great opportunities for networking, for sharing research, for sharing what is working well in the trenches, as well as just being encouraged and prayed for.
Healers and helpers. I mean, what a beautiful way. And they have listen to all those who don't know about OCAMPR. They are a beautiful wealth of resource to anybody struggling medically, mental health wise. They have incredible amounts of research, and the conference is an incredible bout of information that anybody can benefit from who's looking to heal in some way, spiritually, emotionally, or physically. And this year's conference title and the topic of our show tonight is going to be Care in the COVID Era, Unity and Truth in a Time of Uncertainty. And what a great title in terms of what we've all experienced over this last year and a half. So I want to dive into talking a bit about the pandemic, about COVID, and specifically what you are noticing about its psychological impact on not only the population that you're living and working with, but just in the community at large.
I don't know about you and all of our listeners tonight, but it has been a long march since March 2020. I can remember it just like it was yesterday sometimes, thinking about those first initial lockdowns and the first initial sort of, okay, we've got to now transition from everything we know to a lot of what we actually don't know and what's coming around the corner. And I think as we've continued to march along, we've hit new normals and then different normals and then surges and just so many different, just a roller coaster of uncertainty. And I think so much of the pandemic, we're going through this as an entire globe, we're going through this as a nation, but we're all sitting at different seats within the pandemic. And for so many different groups and communities, a lot of it, how you have experienced the pandemic has really depended on your region, what's happening, where are the trends, and how are the resources being spread across your area, your neighborhood, what type of role and work do you serve in, and what are some of your risk factors, and how does all that play together in your community. I think it's very clear to say that this has taken a toll on all of us, right, in just a number of different ways.
I mean, I think that's so true, the region and your perspective and the seat that you're in. I mean, I think everybody has had a vastly different experience. For those who have lost loved ones, this tragedy of sorts and pandemic has turned their worlds upside down in a way that can't necessarily be repaired in whatever sense that they lived before. Whatever life was normal before is no longer going to be normal for them since COVID. And so then there's those who have really said, gee, this time being home has been wonderful, for my home, for my spiritual life. I've really, gotten accomplished a lot of things and connected with my family in different ways. I've slowed down in life. And so then there's the financial strain. A lot of people, are facing the economic struggles as well. So, I mean, and even if you talk to kids, how they feel they've handled the pandemic, I mean, it's kind of across the board. But I think in terms of mental health, I mean, we are definitely seeing, and I'm not sure if you're seeing this in your direct community, but we've definitely seen a worsening of folks who had mental health issues before COVID. We've definitely seen a worsening of their symptoms while the pandemic has been in effect. And the rates of mental health have climbed pretty incredibly, from 10% for those battling depression, anxiety, up to 35% now. So, and 55% for those experiencing financial difficulties, right? So these are some pretty significant numbers in terms of how pandemic has affected us. So I think that the perspective is definitely, I'm kind of curious about your community, in this specific underserved population. What are you specifically seeing there in terms of COVID's effect from their perspective, from the seat that they are in?
Absolutely. The American Psychological Association has published recent research. The 2021 Stress in America survey showed at the beginning of this year, 8 in 10 Americans are feeling emotions associated with stress, whether that's feeling anxious, sad, or angry. People are feeling higher levels of stress in the last several months as compared to back last year around the kind of the start of the pandemic. When we look at how that affects communities of color and communities that are underserved, where there's higher rates of healthcare disparities, we've really seen that number magnified, just as you mentioned. And so also the APA Diversity Task Force has released data on rates of mental health conditions, disorders, and distress has been 4 times the amount in communities of color. during the pandemic. And so what we've really been seeing is sort of a pandemic of paradox, and that there's so many different paradoxes in some of the resources and the resilience and the growth that has come out of this pandemic, as well at the same time, incredibly enormous risk, less access, as well as greater distress. And so holding those two things together has been quite a challenge, and really creates a strain and a toll on many of us that are serving in healthcare, that are serving as mental health professionals, and who are serving as clergy, who are the ones caring for these communities. In our community specifically, on the west side of Chicago, we have noticed an overwhelming, if we're in a pandemic that we were also previously still also are in the opioid epidemic, right where we are in Chicago, we are in the heart of some of the just highest rates of overdose by heroin in the city. And we've got a very intentional ministry for those struggling with opioid use disorder and those who are in recovery for that. Access to much needed mental health as well as substance use treatment services has significantly declined over the pandemic. For many of our patients, we serve in about 15 homeless shelters. For many of those, especially during long stretches of quarantine and the pandemic where folks were on lockdown, they could not leave their shelters. So in order to access their needed medical care or substance use treatment, some of which has been daily. And so that created a huge backlog of folks that have had significant barriers to getting the treatment and the ongoing medications and support that they need. We've seen an increase in of about 20,000 patients that now call us their medical home, just to the overwhelming demand and need. And not all providers and clinics, right, have been able to be sustained during this time. Where we serve in Lawndale, we serve as a safety net site. So that's for folks who live below the federal poverty line. About a third of our patients do not qualify for insurance. And so we really had to continue to transform to meet the needs of our community. What is it that our patients are calling and saying that they need? Well, they can't leave their shelter. They need a refill. How are they going to get their medication? Well, I guess we need to figure out how to serve them via telehealth, and we need to do it quickly. How are we going to start prescribing differently for our patients that can't come on site for some of the normal labs? How are we going to monitor when their diabetes is uncontrolled? Well, we're going to have to get creative. We noticed that for so many of our patients experiencing higher levels of anxiety, for those that maybe already had exposure to high rates of trauma and community violence, for those that may have had a pre-existing condition of post-traumatic stress disorder, we saw a lot of them increase some of their symptoms throughout this pandemic, and that continues to date. So we've had to get very creative in thinking about ways to leverage technology, community, and our relationships to pivot and to find other ways to increase access and to provide quality care. So for the last 9 or so months, I believe, we've started running online audio groups. So dial in, kind of very similar to this format here. I'm much more comfortable with sort of the radio show format, as we have been for some of our patients that have had the highest levels of COVID anxiety and just distress about grief, loss, and bereavement, that they were really seeking out services at really high rates. And so we said, what if we start to create some treatment groups specifically designed to that, and to really bind people together, that even though we can't connect in person, can we all call in from wherever we are across the neighborhood, across the city, and start to share some of the common struggles and start to talk through some of those challenges and then ways to cope in different ways.
What a great idea. And I see in the chat room here, someone's even asking, where would we like to see telemedicine, telehealth based on the need in vulnerable populations? And that's a great question. I think I hear you saying we've had to get really creative, and love that telehealth has opened up. That wasn't something, for those of you who don't know, that wasn't something that was previously opened for therapists pre-COVID. So it's interesting. And it was even opened across state lines for a number of states and still is in certain states. But it would be nice, and I'm not sure your thoughts on this, Dr. Clardy, but that telemedicine was open throughout the nation across state lines and in whatever format to be able to get patients access to care. Because as you're saying, and this is what we're seeing too, that there is not there's just not enough supply for the demand right now in vulnerable populations, for sure, but even across the country in regular communities.
That's correct. Absolutely. I would wholeheartedly agree. In our experience during this time, the reason we've been able to do what we've been able to do is because audio telehealth has been approved during this provisional time of crisis. And so we've seen really the benefit and the power of care, connection, and relationship, and what types of care are able to be provided over the phone. Do all patients like doing phone telehealth visits, right? I'm sure some of us have maybe even had some of those video or phone telehealth visits for different things at certain times, right? Sometimes it's not always as good as the real thing, but it has been, I have been shocked to see how much can be accomplished over the phone. And for some of our patients with significant anxiety, with phobias, with severe panic disorder, they have actually bloomed during the pandemic.
Right.
And they have access care more than they ever have. And we've been able to make significant gains. And so it definitely is, I think it really needs to be put in the hands of the provider and the patient to make those decisions as to which form of care would be best. But we've been able to, ironically, in this time of decreased access, actually access huge other population groups that have had significant transportation barriers, cost barriers.
Exactly.
I can't leave my kids at home barriers. I'm having so much mental health distress that I can't leave my home to come get treatment. So guess what? Treatment's going to come to you. You just have to answer the phone. And so if we can continue to unite nationwide and make sure that we do have equal access and parity, right, that payers of all levels across states, right, would be able to authorize the use of audio only as well as audio and visual forms of telehealth to be used for provider and patient discretion. And the more that we can create flexibility across state lines for reciprocity, again, with appropriate monitoring, right, as far as who's licensed to do what in what state, but as long as we follow the guidelines that have been outlined by some of the major think tank groups, if we can all move toward that, in my experience, the better we can be able to care for those that are interested, indicated, and need treatment to be available.
Absolutely. So let's hope that somebody on the receiving end that can do good with that, and some politicians in government are hearing that, because it is so incredibly important. And you're right, it's opened up so much access to care for so many people that were not accessing care before, and the need is great. So, but I want to talk a bit about some of the effects of isolation, quarantine, and just changes to everyday life. I mean, when we think about the fact that any change, positive or negative, that requires us to adapt in some way, creates this incredible demand on our system. And too many of those demands in a day is what creates stress, right? Internal angst. And everything about the last year and a half has been about adapting to change. Some of which is known, we've come to expect, and some of which is not known, as when somebody gets sick. And so, and there's such a large body of evidence that talks about the protection of having a sense of community and social connection in this larger context of buffering us against stress. And it is what helps people cope. And here we have this incredible storm of isolation with incredible stress. So, maybe you could talk a little bit about, the effects of isolation and quarantine on and what you're seeing in the folks around you and your community.
Absolutely. So for many of our populations, for our teens, for our families, for our single moms, for geriatric populations, when so many of those normative routines were disrupted, exactly like you said, that creates such uncertainty, the disruption of what I come to expect in a given day, how I typically cope with the stressors of my life. What are the ways in which I engage in healthy lifestyle behaviors? If I can't go outside, if I can't go over to my neighbor's house, if I can't connect in the ways that I'm used to, what are my alternatives when I'm inside? What are my alternatives when all of a sudden I'm not going out to work or I'm not going to school anymore? It affects all of us differently. And sometimes that depends on our access and the resources and what our system around us is like, right? What is the
Hmm.
health of our systems around us? And so for many of our patients living in smaller, more confined type housing, for those with a lot of housing insecurity and instability, for those that would live in more cramped flats where there was different family members there weren't some of those outlets and abilities to not as many buffers. And so for some groups of our patients, we have seen increased rates of domestic violence. We have seen
Absolutely.
increased rates of abuse reports, of neglect. We've also seen increased incidences of trauma of all kinds, especially for certain groups of our population, those who have had an incarceration history. We're now confined, right? And so sometimes when we're having to go through quarantine, it's being able to manage that without being re-triggered or re-traumatized based on previous experiences. For
Right.
some of our patients with severe mental illness who maybe don't either have the cognitive capacity or the social supports and resources that are maybe out in the community. Okay, I know I go to my grocery store, I go to my doctor's office, and those are some of the people that provide my sense of community, or my local church when I pop into my parish, right? Those are some of my rhythms and resources. And without those normative benchmarks for people, especially those that are more isolated, who may have more cognitive challenges, or for those who are financially under resourced, that can create a significant level of distress and disruption.
Yeah, I mean, right, that there's that huge link between external stress on family instability, and we have nothing but external stress right now. And you know, I'm so glad you mentioned the rates of domestic violence, because that isn't something that's being talked about, and people have a lot less resources to manage their own elevated stress. There's a lot more tension, shorter fuses, reactivity to misbehavior has gone up, and the financial strain on top of it. You know, so already stressed individuals are having a hard time choosing well, regulating emotion, and these aren't things that we had an instruction manual before COVID broke out, right? So. This is there's a lot of scary things happening behind closed doors, and I think that as being living in part of community, this is something that we need to keep our eye on, checking on people we haven't heard from in a while,
That's
reaching out
right.
to people who we knew had unstable marriages before, or we could see levels of abuse before. These things have all gotten worse, so this is a time to reach out if you know of anybody who's in these circumstances, to reach out, because that has gotten worse over the last year and a half, for a number of individuals, unfortunately.
And to your point, I think also thinking about those who have had pandemic babies. We serve a number of different pregnant, as well as newly delivered mothers in our community, and thinking about what are the supports and the community resources that typically come around families with infants, families with new babies. A lot of that has had to be disrupted during this time. And so, thinking about the incredible isolation that is when you're up
Right.
for
Mm-hmm.
feedings, when you're trying to
Mm-hmm.
get your world situated with an infant, and feeling that typical, normal sense of overwhelm and distress, right? How are we going to do this? And we're not getting sleep, and things are disrupted, and we're concerned about our baby. There's so much joy, right? But also so much overwhelm. And
Mm-hmm.
and so for many folks that have not had those normative routines, either during the pregnancy or that first year of life, that has taken a significant toll.
Mm-hmm.
At the
Mm-hmm.
very same time, I can tell you just as many stories of folks who have left traumatic and abusive situations for sometimes
Mm-hmm.
some of the first times in their life. The pandemic has also brought a clarity about what is important and what our values are. And so we have seen story after story of God at work, bringing a sense of freedom and liberation that, you know what? I can't keep doing this. I can't keep staying in this environment. I can't keep staying in this unhealthy relationship. And so now something about the pandemic, right? That kind of taxing that allostatic load, right? That overload of stress in all areas well, I can't keep doing all of this. So something's got to give here. And can I make a choice towards health? We've seen so many stories of that happening at the very same time. It has truly been a pandemic of paradox.
So that's interesting. I love what you're sharing about God being at work, and I do think there is something about slowing down and a lot of distractions and busyness and things that were removing our, kind of keeping our attention going in other domains. When that is removed, we do see things with clarity, and there really isn't the avoidance. We can't practice the avoidance that we were using before. I've seen a number of marriages come to an end that were, hanging on by a thread for several years. But it was really what you just described, a realization that before life was busy enough to keep us apart, so it was
That's
going.
right.
But really, reprioritizing and regrouping, has allowed for new beginnings and new values to sort of realize. So that's beautiful. Talk to us a little bit about COVID anxiety. I know that's kind of a buzzword right now, but there are a lot of people who are struggling, who have struggled and are continuing to struggle with incredible amounts of anxiety around COVID. This pandemic introduced the perfect storm for people with anxiety. It's a new high stress situation, a new source of health anxiety to manage. And by the way, there's a lot of uncertainty and a complete lack of control. And then there's the fear of losing someone that is very real. And so maybe you could kind of put some words on what that looks like for people who are struggling and who may be able to recognize some signs in their self that this isn't just normal worries that we all experienced during the pandemic.
Absolutely. I think the very first month of the pandemic, we all as clinicians were sort of going around and saying, okay, are you a little bit anxious about this COVID thing? Are you okay? I'm kind of worried about this and that. Well, how are we going to start to figure out which of our patients are having a clinically significant reaction to the pandemic versus ones that are just experiencing normal worries and normal fears because we're in a novel scenario. And so you've hit the nail on the head, I think, with that perfect storm sort of analogy. When we think about going through something that has been such an unknown at the very beginning, and then more and more as information has come out and, guidelines and recommendations on what we can do to keep ourselves safe, we can only do to the best of our ability, right? Because COVID rates are still like the condition is still being transmitted, right? People are still experiencing severe complications with COVID. We're still having hospitalizations and death. There's long haul COVID. And so all of these things are realistic, non-exaggerated threats in our environment. And so it would be typical for really anyone to have some level of concern or worry or mild distress about how am I going to navigate safety for me and my family, my community, right? How will I stay safe? What do I need to do? And when something changes with that's unexpected, when there's something that's unknown, I'm going to feel concerned about it and worried about it. Well, what are we going to do with school? What is my child's daycare going to be closed? All of those things that require multiple dominoes to sort of sort and resort, especially when we don't always have as much margin as we would like. Anybody would feel concerned about that. That's normal. I think where it comes to a different level is almost the way we think about anxiety in general, right? It's normal for us to have worries, thoughts, fears, concerns from time to time, but when is it to the level where it is consuming us or really getting in our way of living well? When is that fear about COVID and the uncertainty starting to consume so much of our mental, emotional, relational, sometimes even financial resources to the point that it's really disrupting our normal day-to-day? Even in the COVID, normal day-to-day, right? And so when people are finding that I am no longer feeling comfortable to interact with my friends and family, to do the things that I enjoy doing, to do the things that I feel a sense of calling, purpose, and meaning because of my fears and worries or concerns about COVID, right? It's not that I've had to learn how to do it differently because of pandemic restrictions, because my child is high risk, right? I'm still prioritizing connection, purpose, meaning, and doing activities. But it's when it's getting in my way, I'm all of a sudden drastically rerouting what I'm doing out of proportion to what the
Yeah.
recommendations or the guidelines are, right? That's when we're starting to notice, hey, this is getting in my ability to, getting in the way of me being able to sleep. This is getting in
Hmm.
the way of me being able to parent in the way that I want to. This is
Hmm.
getting in my way of, having the type of marriage that I want to. We are not seeing eye to eye about this.
Hmm.
And I am so tense and distressed that it's taking a toll on my physical health.
Right. And I think that, that's exactly right. I mean, fear is so normal, right? If you are not fearful at all in this situation, I would likely think that you are in denial and sort of avoiding, connecting to what's happening, and really like functional fear is good, right? That is what makes us take proper precautions and listen to safety measures. And research shows that's what actually helps people follow the directions that we need to be following as a community. So it's sort of functional fear, but it is the one that's sort of that roaming freely, kind of left unchecked. We're not really checking it or putting walls around it. And I love what you said, because it is when it affects our values and our priorities and the things that God has planned for our lives, and we stop living in order to protect, that it is all consuming. And it's almost like a slow corrosion. It subtly corrodes our life and you don't even realize it, but slowly you've kind of given up, everything that once mattered, and it breeds almost a depression, and if left unchecked, right? And so I think that's something that we have to be paying attention to. I mean, it's okay to not be okay. And I think we want to be careful to not give that message, right? That it's okay to be sad. It's okay to be worried. It's okay to not feel very strong. But really, if it is immobilizing us, and I think that is the word of the day that you described, if it is stopping God's purpose in our lives and his will for our lives, and everything that we value, then that fear is the only thing interpreting what's going on. And we've forgotten everything else that's supposed to buffer us in fear. And this isn't easy, because I think the political discussion has complicated this much more so. I mean, wouldn't you say that we don't have a consistent message coming from the top down that makes it easy to know where to be afraid and where to draw the line?
That's right. And I think we're, especially as Orthodox Christians, we need to be looking for where we are putting our trust, our hope, also our identity and our sources of truth. We need to be remembering that our identity does not lie in our political affiliations, our socio-cultural, regional sort of ties and alliances. We put our faith and our hope in Jesus Christ and his church. And we need to be in dialogue with science, the best research and information that we can get our hands on, what our priest is recommending, what our own healthcare providers are recommending for our specific situations, as well as what our particular family values and cultural beliefs are. And it is in that wrestling together, right, as we try to figure out, how do we all respond to uncertainty when there's differing perspectives, there's differing types of information out there? How do we discern what is real and
Right.
what is true?
Right. Right. And we're not supposed to manage it all on our own, right? I mean, that's when fear
Absolutely
really
not.
grabs hold of us and begins instructing us, but as the Psalm 37:7, I love this. And I probably read it every day during the pandemic. In our weakness, in our worry, through prayer and with a humble heart, reach out to God and be still before the Lord and wait patiently for him. And we are promised that when we call upon him, when we come to him, when we pray, that he will be there to listen, as it says in Jeremiah. And so we have to be seeking him in that space of anxiety. And if anybody is listening who is in that space of overwhelming worry that is incapacitating, this is the time to recognize we're not supposed to go through that alone. Because on our own, we often misinterpret, and we often start receiving the wrong guidance. We are not the only person who needs to be instructing ourselves.
That's right.
And so faith is meant to arm us, right? It's not going to necessarily take away our fear. It just kind of gives us the promises in his love as we sort of walk through it. And God is very clear in the Bible about, so everywhere throughout the Bible, he keeps reminding us, come to me, bring it to me, bring all my fears, cast all your anxieties, give it to me. I'm here, I'm waiting. And so, that's, I think, what we're called to do in those moments. So I know that that's happening in more ways than one across the nation right now. And so let's move into this very important topic that I think has affected a number of our listeners. I know many have written me about this in relation to this show. But let's talk about those who have endured loss. Those grieving the death of a loved ones. The worst case scenario did happen for these families. And how can our church be a refuge and a resource for these individuals?
There has been a particular twinge, deluge of sadness and guilt and grief around bereavement that has happened during the time of pandemic, because we don't have some of the normative cultural and even religious practices of being able to come together to grieve and to comfort one another. In the Orthodox Church, what are some of our rituals dating back from the very beginning? For instance, we celebrate every Pascha reading the Psalms at the tomb of Christ, really grieving and mourning together and walking through that versus feeling isolated and alone, performing last rites, right? Giving last communion and sort of some of those types of things that people have had to see their loved ones die or learn about it in very unnatural and untimely ways. We're not necessarily ever ready for death, but it certainly can hit in a different way and bring additional complications when it happens at an age that we are not expecting. It happens on an untimely circumstance, and it happens very quickly. That's not been the story for everyone during COVID, but it has been the story for many. And also having that additional pain of, I wasn't there to say goodbye. Right. I wasn't there to comfort them, to be there in their last moments. Typically, if someone that I love has been lost after a battle in the ICU unit, I'm at least there, and we're able to sort of grieve and have some moment of closure. Whereas people were having to figure out how to do that in the virtual space, people were having to do that over the phone, people weren't able to do that at all. It happened too quickly.
Right.
And so there's that additional trauma that comes from the loss, but also feeling guilty, concerned, as though their loved one had to suffer, that their loved one was in pain, and that their loved one was alone, and that we did not get to do how I would have liked to say goodbye to our father, or to do his funeral, or to be able to gather with friends and remember him, right? And so you hear so many stories of that. There's also a number of families and communities that have had loss on top of loss on top of loss at disproportionately high rates.
Right.
For many in our community, we have a significant section of our curriculum in our audio stress call-in group about grief and bereavement. I often think about, when I think about loss during the pandemic, a patient who's, has given me permission to just share a snippet of her story, but she has lost 7 family members to COVID.
Oh my goodness. Wow.
And she's talking to me in a visit about her concern about COVID and what if I was exposed. And 18 of her other family members either were on quarantine or currently had it, or had had it in the past month, all that lived in her building. Wow. And so when you sit in those stories with people, and when you are walking alongside them, sometimes it is just being a healing presence. And it is nothing of ourselves, right? It is only the healing that comes from the Holy Spirit. But it is simply attempting to understand what someone's experience has been like, and to help pick apart some of the layers of the onion of what makes this particularly difficult in this time.
Yeah, particularly difficult. I think those are great words, because this is a loss that is not experienced like any other loss that we've ever. I had a doctor tell me the other day that this is listen, we make a soft code soft code call when this happens, because they recognize that the need to rush in is not there, because they're not going to be able to do anything about it when someone's coding, with COVID. And to hear that just broke my spirit. I didn't even know, I had no words in hearing that. The immense suffering for the individual and for the family, and the fear that must be taking place. And so, and I think that there's the collateral damage that follows even after death that I think we don't think about in stories where after loss, we don't know how to bounce back. And so if we struggled with mental illness before that, now we are suicidal at this point, at the thought of, I can't go on without this individual in my life. Addictions are worsening. The ability to give toward other members of your family isn't present, because when you're grieving, it's very hard. Your capacity is so low, below where it should be. You don't have the ability to love and to be present and to do the things that you need to do. You can hardly get up in the morning. And so there is incredible collateral damage in the months and months and months following death that, I just encourage listeners that if you know of anyone who has experienced a death in their family or a loss, and you were with them during that time or during that week, and you came to the memorial, you came to the church, to reach out, though it's been months later, because this is the collateral damage is just
That's
beginning.
right.
And people feel most alone in those times. And so the church can be a huge refuge in our ability to share the light with individuals who feel so isolated in those times.
That's right.
So the church as a resource, I mean, let's talk about that, because I think, for many, not everyone is technically even back to physical presence within the church, which is, it's just, I don't know how it is in Chicago. For us, this sort of January was sort of the opening where we kind of began coming back, of course, with masks and social distancing and all of these things. Prior to that, it was so much was virtual. But even still, and it's understandable, there are many who aren't able to come and connect, though they want to, because, they're worried, they're concerned, and we understand that. So how can the church, maybe this is something to think about, and how can mental health providers in the church be ministering to people who aren't able to use the church as the resource that they once did?
That's right. I think this really has highlighted, the value of presence and community. I mean, we believe in the very literal, real presence in the body and blood of Christ, and how that can negatively affect us, and how that can create a huge sense of loss when we're not able to receive the sacraments, when we're not able to participate in the liturgy in person, when we're not able to make those bodily movements and kind of engage in worship with our very bodies, with our voices, with the very active participation that's happening. And at the same time, we've also seen rates of people accessing the church in new ways through virtual streaming and through online resources, and being able to connect in new and different ways. It's in no way the same, right? And it definitely leaves a lot to be desired. I know I have been feeling such a sense of disconnection, just in not being able to attend services as much as I would like in person, and having that sense of disconnect. But I think that's where the wisdom of the church offers us in its rituals, in its routines, in its constancy. Even when, this is not the church's first pandemic. It may be ours, but it is not the church's first pandemic by any means. And the church has endured over time through all manner of war, famine, pandemic, loss, tragedy. And that is where we can take refuge in the power of the prayers and the liturgy and the things that we pray. We can pray in our very own homes, right? Our own families and homes are to be our little church, and that we connect to the larger church. And so I think the more we can stay connected and grounded in praying the liturgy at home, in reviewing the Psalms, in reading the readings for the day, listening to Ancient Faith Radio, or streaming your parish,
Right.
or any number of the parishes worldwide that continue to stream those. There's a number of resources that we can remind ourselves of that connection and stay connected in to the vine that is available in the church, especially when things feel so uncertain and destabilizing.
Mm-hmm.
We
Yeah.
have the gift of a church that is a rock that the gates of hell will not prevail against. And so
Right.
we need to be dialed into that when everything around us feels uncertain and we don't know what to trust or what sources to trust. But even whether we're there in person or whether we're connecting virtually, doing our best to unite ourselves to the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church, whatever that might look like under unusual
Yeah,
circumstances.
absolutely. And I think bringing our experiences to the church, even if you're calling your priest, and because the isolation has left us to the spiritual warfare is a very real concept that is darkening the doors of a lot of people's hearts in this times. And I mean, I'm just reminded of a phone call I had with someone yesterday. It's like, I just don't know how God could be allowing this, and I'm losing any sense of understanding anymore in my faith. And and I had asked, they were not part of our church, but I said, is your priest talking about this? And she said, no. And so, I think we have to be relevant as a church to be talking about the issues, talking about people's doubt, talking about people's fear, talking about what trials look like, and when we face dark seasons, what that looks like through the lens of the Bible, and how God instructs us. I mean, listen, despair and trials and seasons of darkness were just all throughout. I mean, you can't read more than 2 pages without finding despair across the Bible. And so how we are taught to walk through that, I think we have to be having those conversations with our people as well. But gosh, this has been such an interesting conversation. I don't even know how we forgot to take a break. But we only have about 5 to 10 minutes left here.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm just getting lost here in my conversation with you here.
No,
but
not at all.
Maybe we could just sort of kind of come back around full circle. We've talked a lot about sort of the negative side of COVID. But what has COVID taught us about connection and about community, and perhaps weigh in on our realization of our interdependence on one another as this gigantic piece of woven fabric? We cannot do anything without impacting our each other, our fellow souls. So
right.
Let's talk about that a bit, about what it's taught us about connection and community.
I think that for so many of us, this time of separation from our old normal routines, separation physically from others in certain circumstances, and then for others who have not experienced that much change in their daily life at all. Whatever camp you have found yourself in during this time, I do think it has brought a greater sense of clarity about what's important to each of us, what our values are, what has meaning and what holds meaning for us. Those are the things that, when those are violated, tend to stir up our frustration and agitation and our sense of injustice, and this isn't right. And so I think in many ways, whether that's really hunkering down on these people are my tribe, these are the people that I have done the pandemic with, this is my pandemic pod, these are my people that have been people that I saw in and out of quarantine or COVID or come what may, right? We wrestle together with what do we do about school and masks and how do we handle this challenge or that challenge, with the people who were our go-tos when we could not necessarily connect with others or travel or visit loved ones, or we were concerned to visit those that, either elderly or those that are high risk in our families. Who were the people that we were reaching out to? Who were the people that it felt easy to connect with during those times of such isolation and disruption? I think that's so important. And it tells us a lot about the strength of community, how it can change and be formed over time, and also what are some of the qualities of healthy relationships that I have noticed that have really stood out to me? What are some of the things that I want to value spending my time doing? For some of us, we've had an abundance of time, and others of us, we have had not near enough time during the pandemic. And so I think it has messed with our status quo, right? Whatever that has been, and it has disrupted a little bit. And then we have to intentionally do a card deck resort to say, okay, how am I going to spend the 24 hours that I have each day with whom and doing what? And so really kind of wrestling with what is my identity? Where am I putting that in? And in what ways am I going about some things alone? And where is there a danger in that? Because I love what you said earlier, that idea that when we are alone and sort of isolated, that's when not only can the enemy attack us with, just a little bit of truth to make it a very convincing delusion,
absolutely.
right? And derision of that. And then how are we connecting to people of similar values, of like-minded faith principles that can help ground us and reconnect us, even if we don't see eye to eye on every issue, even as we have different perspectives.
And I think that's super important, right? Like, how are we dealing? What have we learned about ourselves in relation to dealing with someone who thinks completely different than I do? And I think that the pandemic has exposed realities within us that simmered beneath the surface that we may not have realized existed. And I always, I love Einstein when he said it, in every difficulty lies opportunity. And I think we have to think about the opportunities that COVID has caused us to self-reflect on in relation to community. Our compassion has increased. For those of us who never really thought of other people, now we do, because you can't go 2 steps without talking to somebody who's lost somebody, who's fighting on the front lines. We have gratitude for being able to go to church or to the grocery store when we couldn't just 6 months ago. It's opened, I think, illuminated a light that I think always existed, but we didn't ever tap into in relation to community. So if there's that one piece of silver lining we could find, I would say that that's a big piece of it. But Dr. Clardy, we have so enjoyed this conversation. I have really so much more that I wanted to get to, but clearly I have run out of time because it's a deep topic. But I want to thank you so much for being part of our show. And I want to just tell our listeners a little bit about this upcoming conference. If you're interested in the topic that we just talked about today, and if you want to know more about care in the COVID era, unity and truth in a time of uncertainty, that is the conference title, OCAMPR. It's OCAMPR, Orthodox Christian Association of Medicine, Psychology, and Religion. Dr. Clardy will be speaking there along with many, many other keynote speakers. The conference is November 4th through the 6th in Phoenix, Arizona. And Dr. Clardy, could you give a website for all of our listeners if they want to find out how they can register or become a part of this organization?
Absolutely. It is on the OCAMPR website. It's very simple, ocamper.org. So definitely go there, check it out.
Wonderful. Well, thanks so much, Dr. Clardy. And we want to thank all of our listeners for joining us tonight. I know I didn't reach quite all your questions that came in to the Facebook page. I can see quite a few, but I will try to get to those via email. Thank you to our wonderful broadcast team for making tonight's show possible. Thank you to John Maddox, tonight's producer, and all the great people at both Ancient Faith and St. John the Divine who make this ministry possible. Special prayers continue to go out to Trudy Richter, our show's producer of Live with the Lows, who is currently mourning the loss of her dear husband, Father Stacy. So continued prayers for her. So have a wonderful week, all of our listeners. And as always, we look forward to connecting with you next week on Live with the Lows.
Father Nick and Dr. Roxanne are the authors of the book Renewing You, a priest, a psychologist, and a plan, which can be purchased at store.ancientfaith.com. Their daily inspirational messages can be found at thelows.com/subscribe. Be sure also to search for The Lows on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. Live with the Lows is a listener-supported presentation of Ancient Faith Radio.
Hello, this is Metropolitan Gregory, and I'm the Secretary of the Assembly of Canonical Orthodox Bishops.
Father Nick and Dr. Roxanne are the